right, well, here we are, Deanna. Lovely to be here. How's it going today?
Thanks for having me. Today's been pretty good so far. Yeah, had a nice walk with my dog. Had some clients this morning. All is okay. Yeah.
Beautiful.
How are you doing?
How am I doing? Yeah, I'm doing a late night tonight. Loads to do, but I managed to get out and have lunch with my wife and my son today, which was really nice. Kind of just made the effort just to cram that time in. So I was really happy about that.
Great. I'm feeling that too. Yeah.
It's your first time on the show, so welcome.
Thank you.
I know you and Kyle go way back, and you've done some good work, and you're now one of our teachers in Vital. So it's really good that we're working more with you. I wanted to just say well done for practicing self-care the last few years as you were finishing off your master's degree. And yeah, really, that was amazing. How did you manage to kind of put those boundaries in place? I really need to learn from you.
I think it was just life's necessity of parenting, school, personal life. I mean, I'm still working and still in many ways doing lots of other things, but it just was, life made that happen, I'd say, in many ways. And I guess I just listened.
Beautiful. Yeah, listening to life. Well, I'd love to start off by you telling us about you, because you're the best person to do that, Deanna. So do you want to tell folks, especially as it's your first time on the Psychedelics Today podcast, just to tell folks about you personally, professionally, and how psychedelics became a part of your life?
Sure, yeah. I guess that's a really big question, so I'll try and give a short answer in terms of how psychedelics became a part of my life. But I started working just for my own curiosity and healing about 15 years ago with ayahuasca. And to be honest, I was pretty naive at the moment in terms of what I was getting myself into. And I actually had a really difficult year after my first ayahuasca experience, and a lot of things fell apart. And I think that really ignited, I was like, something happened here that was really important, but I struggled a lot in that year after. And I tried to find support, and that was before people were really talking about integration work. And that, in many ways, fueled, I think, a lot of the work that I do today. And so in 2013, I went to Peru, and I worked at the Temple of the Way of Light. So I had a calling to this work, and I kept going, even though it was pretty disruptive in many ways. But I worked at the Temple of the Way of Light for about 3.5 to 4 years. I came back to Canada, started doing preparation, integration, and also doing assessment for the retreat center in Peru. And from there, I realized I needed to learn a lot more about trauma, and studied Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. And when I was also in Peru, I had the really amazing opportunity to go to Mexico and work with Gabor Mate and learn and kind of shadow him and learn alongside him. And that's where integration again really kind of clicked, because he was really skilled at helping people take these like otherworldly experiences, or kind of somatic experiences, or these kind of concepts that would come up in ceremonies, and connect them with their everyday lives. So I'd say throughout the years, I had this steady passion growing for integration, and trying to help people extend past just the medicine or ceremony experience. And then finally went and got my master's, as we were just talking about. And so now I'm a registered clinical counselor in British Columbia, and a somatic experiencing practitioner, and do work for Numinous Wellness. So do curriculum development and training, work with integration circle sometimes, do some work for Double Blind, and have my own private practice. So yeah, and I'd say this work keeps me engaged, keeps me inspired, and keeps me learning in many ways. There's a lot that I've learned over the years, but there's so much that I also feel like I don't know. And I think that that's really a really sweet spot to be in. It keeps me inspired to keep going and learning. So yeah, happy to be here, happy to have this conversation.
Welcome, Deanna. Yeah, I'd love us to have some moments to tune into those experiences you had in the Amazon, and with compassionate inquiry and somatic experiencing. Really awesome, training you've had. And I love that you're saying, obviously there's still so much more, kind of infinite amount. So
Yeah.
as a step into the infinitude, we always start our Vital Psychedelic Conversations with a question about what is one of the most vital topics relating to psychedelics that you think we should all be talking about right now. What's coming up for you around that question?
Yeah, I think the first thing that popped up for me when I saw that question was really around like this question mark that's in the field right now in terms of access. And so I know there was just the recent FDA decision around not approving MDMA assisted therapy. And I think most people were putting a lot of eggs in that basket in terms of if this is approved, this will kind of open up and allow a lot more accessibility for folks moving forward. And so I think the big question for me, because there's this kind of underground growing scene of practitioners, some who are very skilled, some who are not. And so I think the big question for me is what do we do as a movement right now in terms of providing access? Where do we encourage folks to go? There's a lot of interest from, what if we want to call them clients or people just looking to feel better within themselves. And so I think there's this kind of growing tension of how do we as clinicians or practitioners guide people who are wanting to do this work, and where can people go, and what does this delay mean? And so I think that that's part of what's I'm kind of being drawn to think about and to be curious about right now, because I think that there's a lot of people who are really seeking these treatments and not a lot of legal options at this moment. And so there's some kind of different um, places where folks can go, but I think that's going to be just a tension in the field for this next little while. So I don't know if I have a particular answer to that, but what does it mean, I think, for all of us going forward from this point on, in terms of if there is still limited access?
Yeah. No, it's a question we don't really know the answer to, but we simply have to be asking, don't we?
Yeah,
Especially with with Lycos not being approved, and I think there was, up until 6 months ago, everyone thought they would be for MDMA
exactly.
assisted treatment, and then
Yeah,
things started to unravel, and it looks like it's going to be at least 2 years.
yeah,
So what does that mean? Like, are we just going to wait another 2 years before, for tens of thousands of people, and the trainings isn't probably going to happen for years anyway for Lycos? So, what do people do in that time? And even if they're looking at ketamine treatment, it's still really expensive, and insurance isn't covering it for most people. So what do we do? Yeah, it's a really, really important question, and I think, I've seen a lot of folks saying that, in a sense, the safety net is the underground.
yeah,
That is continuing and will continue for the foreseeable future, and that's where a lot of harm reduction comes into how we navigate that underground world, and around competence is really, really important as a part of that, and our role, like, as practitioners, it's really hard to know what we can say and who we can say it to, and who we can say what we say it to. It's
yeah.
really, it probably shouldn't be that difficult, but obviously it is for certain reasons. Yeah. What about in Canada? Are there any kind of bright shoots poking through around access to psychedelic medicine and healing?
Yeah, there is a special access program currently, although I think we're about to have a pretty big government change, which might not lead to positive results in this. But currently, people can have access to these medicines. But again, someone just that I heard of that applied for an application, they quoted the therapy model of the kind of following the Lycos protocol, and it was about $20,000 to go through that treatment, to with the medicine sessions and the integration and preparation. built in. So, there's a lot of questions, and it's true. A lot of people are kind of turning to the underground, and even yeah, folks with licenses calling it harm reduction and sitting with clients. And so, I think the biggest kind of question out of that is like, how do we live in the gray area and with these kind of ethical questions that are involved, and without, there's some drawbacks of regulation, and there's also some positives around competency, is what you were speaking to. And so I think it's just about how do we as practitioners show up to this kind of, I'd say, growing gray area of these medicines, and what can we encourage folks that are, providing those opportunities to be informed, to have things like supervision, or what skills, or how do they kind of hold themselves within this work. So I think that it's maybe a lot of like self-reflection for practitioners who are offering these services, and then I think really honoring what they know and what they don't know. That's kind of where a lot of harm can happen, is when people pretend they have a skill set that they don't, and maybe get in over their heads. And again, like, it's almost always coming from a place that they want to help people, and so it's coming from good intentions. Um, but just, yeah, I think it's something that we're going to have to grapple with for a while to come.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that point around competence and the decision making we have around boundaries and where my limits are. And I love what you're saying. Yeah, on one hand, we've got this really positive intention to help, and there's a massive need for that. And if I don't step forwards, maybe there's no one else. But yeah, we really need to know that we've got those skills, that we understand our client's reality and perhaps what may come up and the expectations, and that we can kind of manage that. Before we kind of dive into the really broad topic of trauma and psychedelics for trauma, I'd love to just locate our conversation in the Amazon and when you went there, quite a while ago. And particularly I'm thinking about, for me, the place that trauma lives inside of us is really closely kind of embodied and connected to our inner healing intelligence. And it's almost like a thread that leads us to, in a sense, the treasure of our trauma. And without wanting to project onto what your journey into the Amazon was for, I'd love to ask the question, what was it for? And if it's okay to really situate, like, when you were going there, what was the voice that you were tuning into, and how do you conceptualize what that voice was as you were preparing to go, and as you were kind of there, and for years that you were there, kind of how did those parts of you kind of evolve over time? And how did your kind of journey evolve around the meaning that it had?
Yeah, again, another big question. um, yeah, I think that, it was interesting. Like, when I was first drawn to plant medicines, it was really a lot around this question around, I was always a sensitive kid, and I always felt like I had a spiritual side to me, although it didn't kind of match up to Christianity, which was the model I was given as a child. And so some of my own calling was around this, like, what is a spiritual practice? What are these bigger questions that I have, like, they're not being answered by day to day life, and to what's kind of available to me. And so I never went there with the intention of wanting to become a curandero or curandera, like a healer. I think it was for my own healing, my own curiosity. And then, really, one thing that people talk about when they often work with ayahuasca or different plant medicines is there was a calling. I did go to the Amazon once before I moved there. And so I was working for a university at the time in Vancouver, and finished a contract. And then all of a sudden, if I'm being totally transparent, I just had these reoccurring dreams that would come again and again about this center, and I didn't know what it was. And then actually, we had some Peruvian folks staying at our house in Vancouver, who were there to, they were Indigenous leaders and they were there to talk to oil companies about what they were doing in their territory. And so folks that were there with them just came from this place, the Temple of the Way of Light in Peru. And I looked it up and I was like, oh, that's the place. And so, yeah, it's one of those
Wow.
magical, fantastical stories. But I said, okay, I'll go. And I decided to go on a work exchange. And after a few weeks, they offered if I wanted to train as a facilitator. So it just kind of felt like it was one of those meant to be moments. And I think there was just these questions inside of me that weren't being answered, and just kind of some dual longing for something deeper, and then also just trying to work through some of my own healing and some of my own making sense of the world and my own body and experience. And so there was definitely something guiding me. And then if that's internal and external, I think it's a bit of both. So my own inner healer, and then also there was something from the Amazon that was really calling me.
Wow. That's awesome, especially the dream piece there, and that you're kind of tuned into it and trusting it as well.
Yeah, it kept
Yeah, is that
coming.
something that you've done quite a bit of with dreams in particular, like just like attuning that, kind of doing that dream work?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I've noticed since having a kid that world has like shut down a little bit. Like it used to be so vivid and so fantastical, and I used to kind of play with my dreams and um, listen to themes, I'd say, from the dream world, and so that was definitely a big part of my world for many years. And I'd say a little bit less so now that I have a child. I don't know why or how, but yeah.
Yeah, everything changed. Yeah.
Everything changes,
Oh
as
my
you
God.
know.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Well, yeah, thank you for kind of situating your experience there. The next piece I want to do, this isn't going to be your autobiography, but just as the next question, I'm
Sure.
really fascinated by some of the training that you've done, like you just mentioned, with Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, compassionate
Yeah.
inquiry, and somatic experiencing, and
Mhm.
particularly just doing a bit of research, Deanna, that there's two really similar quotes that they have around
Mm.
like what trauma is. So I thought it would be nice to give the quotes and then help us to just unpack like how should we understand trauma.
And think about trauma.
What are
Yeah,
some ways
yeah.
of understanding it? Because I think there's just different models that help us just conceptualize it, but just kind of feel into it and relate to it, so it's less academic. So the Gabor Mate quote I found was that trauma is not what happened to you, it's what happens inside you now as a result of what happened to you. And the Peter Levine quote is, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And so that's kind of giving us, yeah, quite a few different nuggets of wisdom to go. For me, one of the things it's speaking about is it's never too late to heal, and it lives inside of us, and in a sense, we can never get rid of it, hide it, run away from it. It's there, and facing it is actually part of who we are. Like, it's coming to terms with that, and it's then unpacking it, revealing it, opening it up. And there's aspects of post-traumatic growth in there as well that we get. Like, that's almost part of the reward from facing it and going in there. So I just wanted to, turn that into a question for you. Kind of hearing those quotes and having been through those courses and learning from those kind of masters, what are some of the ways that you've learned to understand trauma and also to kind of feel it and to kind of live and work with it?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for finding those two quotes. I think that, you know, I resonate with what you're sharing about that it's never too late. What those quotes and this perspective on trauma entails is that it's not some event that's happened in the past that we can never change. There are traumatic events, and I don't want to belittle or discredit them, but it's about what's the ongoing impact that's still available to us now, or still accessible, or that we have a pathway to engage with. And it's all of these different ways that those events have impacted us. And, often when I think about trauma too, I think about our animal self and then this kind of more rational mind part. And so if, a lot of Peter Levine's work is based on the nervous system. So there's all these patterns and all of these, as you what said, like what happens inside of you. And that's still going on in the present moment. And so that's the biggest thing is kind of there's access to healing in the present moment. And so there's this kind of animal part of us that is happening unconsciously, and it's in the autonomic nervous system. So it's there, it's happening under the surface. And, what I think these medicines can do or trauma therapy can do is start to get us in relationship with that animal part as well as the kind of rational part as well. And I think that it's a lot more empowering to have this stance of, okay, it's these things that are still playing out. Can we start to bring, I think that empathetic witness is essential and is something that we teach when we teach about psychedelics. It's about how do we bring compassion, or sometimes that's more wrathful compassion, and presence to these different aspects of self, these parts of self, these emotions, these feelings, these sensations, and start to build a relationship to it. And so, one of the biggest impacts of trauma is this fragmentation. So different aspects of self get cut off, different um, sensations, emotions, this disconnect between mind and body, disconnect between spirit, or the question of belonging. All of these things can be cut off through trauma. And so what we're trying to do is to start to build that reconnection. And, how I feel it, trauma, when I'm working with clients, I would say it's about their belief about themselves. It's the way they see the world. It's their relationship to the world. It's the relationship to their body. It is a lot about, is it okay for them to go towards discomfort? Is it okay for them to, um, engage in something that might feel risky? Can they go out of their home? How do they see the world as a whole? Is it a threatening place? Is it a welcoming place? Um, do they get stuck in certain patterns? There's so many different ways that trauma can show up. And I feel like it's kind of being used really generally these days in terms of this is trauma. But really, I think a lot of what we're trying to talk about is these different nervous system states and how they influences the stories we have about ourselves and the world, and how those beliefs reinforce different nervous system states. And so, what we try and do is to see, okay, can we interrupt those stories? Can we interrupt those states? Are there other parts of them that are available? Is our nervous system flexible? Can we start to not follow the same patterns of their physiology and of their thinking? And can we bring in different perspectives? And I know we'll talk about that later, but that's, I think, where some of the potential comes with psychedelics. So yeah, that's my kind of long answer about what trauma
Yeah,
is and how it can look.
yeah, and I'll just share personally. Like I have and hold a lot of trauma from my life and from my ancestors' life, intergenerational trauma from multiple genocides. But I never really knew what it was until I kind of felt it in my body. Before then, it was just a word, and it was like, oh, some things from the past, almost like a history lesson, like a concept. But when I actually started to feel it in my body, and my body kind of expressed it and shook it out, and by doing that, it kind of activated, tears and screams and, words and memories. That's when I really started to understand it, where trauma lives and kind of how it manifests. And using psychedelics in particular, it's been really helpful to face it in a sense. Like it's helped me to face what is there and that part of me that's always known it's there, to, in a sense, to give that part of me the courage and the reassurance that it's going to be held, it's going to be worth it, and that, you know, it's going in with its kind of consent in a way. Whereas in the past there was just a lot of blockages, and, you know, anyway, this isn't a therapy session, but my point is, it's through feeling it, and psychedelics for me have been a really powerful part of being able to feel that in. So it's not just like an academic piece. And as a therapist as well, like I was trained as, you know, in psychoanalysis, and, you know, just your average social work school in Australia and in England, there's nothing somatic related to there. Like the body didn't really exist. So it's only really been doing this kind of work that it's kind of revolutionary, to be honest. And it was really in the Vital program, in the second cohort, you know, that I started to really get what people were talking about there. You know, Devon Christie was one of our teachers in that cohort around this topic. And it is revolutionary, I think, as a way of just conceptualizing it, but just feeling it, like learning to feel and giving our body permission to kind of wake up and transmit what it holds. I don't know if you ever had like a wake up kind of revolutionary moment, or if you also kind of relate to this as being somewhat revolutionary.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's interesting because my first real introduction was through plant medicines, not through academia on this topic. And I would just see consistently, you know, so again, if we think about the mechanism of trauma, it's protective. So our animal part decided there's things that we need to just kind of keep down because there's that lack of the empathetic witness, going back to Peter Levine's quote. It's not safe enough for us to express this, to allow it, or we get conditioned, or there's cultural norms. And so, yeah, in Peru, I would just see people coming down there and they would just be like, oh my God, first, I have a body. Oh my gosh, there's so much stuff in my body. There's grief that is intergenerational that hasn't had the space to be felt, or even the realization I feel so unsafe in my body. And you know, personally, yeah, that's been a big part of it. You know, a lot of my conditioning, I think, was around um, just the suck it up, get through, don't feel your feelings. You know, it's just that was kind of how I grew up. And then as a sensitive kid, um, yeah, I just had all this stuff that I was like, oh my gosh, like where did this come from? So if it's shaking, crying, emotions, I think it's really, you know, what if these medicines are held in the right space and there's the right dosage, they allow us that access to those things that our animal part said, no, we're not going to go there. And what they call bottom up processing, it allows us to access those sensations, those feelings, and allow those incomplete trauma responses or those things that have been held that space. There's all of a sudden more capacity to move through those and feel those and not get lost in the meaning or interpretation of it. I think is a really important piece to just kind of give the body permission to do what it wants to do, which is to allow these things to move. But I would say safety is really paramount in that.
Yeah, and let's take that really important, you know, value and skill and practice of safety, both with ourselves and when working others, and expand it onto this idea of being trauma informed as a kind of, you know, a safety tool. And starting with this context that the trauma has become somewhat overused, perhaps. It can be a little bit too kind of, you know, bland and flippant. And at the same time, I think a lot of us are experiencing more trauma and also doing more trauma work one way or the other. Where should we position this concept of being trauma informed, how it relates to psychedelic use when we're working as a practitioner with other folks? Like why are we saying it's important to be trauma informed, especially if we're working with people that are using psychedelics, or particularly if we're sitting with people as a guide or as a sitter, facilitator when they're using psychedelics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, I think some of the principles I think about when I think about trauma informed care are that we're providing choice, that we're collaborating and ultimately trying to encourage like empowerment or autonomy in our clients. And then I'd say it's also about kind of helping them to safely explore the edges of their window of tolerance. So this is kind of another term that gets used a lot these days, but we're trying to help them to, safely go to those spaces where they can explore that discomfort, the pain, the emotion. And why these things are important, because you want to think about what was lost in these traumatic events. So often that is, again, I'm coming back to this quote a lot, but the empathetic witness. So someone to be there to encourage them, to support them, to hold them, to be attuned to the person. Um, a lot of times, choice is lost in trauma. Um, and so that's one thing we really want to encourage, is someone to feel like, oh, I have agency. I can choose if I want to have eye shades on or not. I can choose if I want silence for 20 minutes in a medicine session, or if I want to listen to the music, or if I hate this song, I feel like I'm empowered enough to say, change the song, or that I don't want touch and that I have boundaries. So, we want to think about what are the things that were lost for folks along the way that were exposed to trauma, or and sometimes like even just conditioning, allowing to speak their needs, allowing to have their expression. And how do we create the conditions for those things to unfold? And so, why it's important is because if we're putting our agenda on someone's healing session, it's in and of itself disempowering for the client. And agency is one of the main things. I think, along with regulation and agency and tools, that I think all come under the umbrella of this healing intelligence. These are the things that we're trying to really support our client to engage in. And so if we're taking those things away just by the way we set up maybe our psychedelic therapy, or how we sit with them, then I think a lot can be lost. And so I don't think it's about throwing away, our tools and our clinical judgment or our intuition. Um, but just, I think this kind of bleeds into the conversation around, I've seen on one end of the spectrum in Peru where, shamans are very engaged, they're very present. They're doing energetic surgeries on your body with Icaros, and it's very much a lot around kind of the what can the healer do, and they don't discredit the inner healing intelligence in that work, but it's a lot of very engaged. And then we also have on the other end people who encourage a blindfold and earphones for 5 hours. People are not supposed to come out of that, and they're very kind of disengaged in there as a sitter. And then there's kind of a gray area in between of maybe you're doing more therapeutic interventions, you're directing a little bit more, or maybe you're, I know the Somatic Psychedelic Institute, there's some inhibiting of certain somatic responses. So there's a whole spectrum of treatment that's happening. And so I think, there's these, what you're trying to provide for your client, but then there's also really understanding where am I and who am I within this field right now? What are my skills? Can I be very transparent that this is the scope of my practice? And have that self reflection. I think as a practitioner, like that's part of also being trauma informed, is how do I fit into this and how do I not? I have someone who has complex trauma. Am I the person, if I do sitting for some folks, am I the person to provide them with that service of psychedelic assisted therapy? I don't know. So this is part of what I hope practitioners or sitters will do. How do I talk about my work? Am I talking about that I have a cure for whatever they're experiencing, or that they'll feel better directly after the experience? Um, I think it's a lot about the kind of practitioner side, and then also in terms of how we engage with the client. And so I do think as a practitioner, it's very helpful to have some frameworks. So basic understanding of the nervous system, of these different trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, of helping clients to turn towards and feeling what's happening in their body. What are the conditions that are going to support them to do that? Can you offer some practices and preparation that might support them to do that? Can you understand or conceptualize? Do you have a frame of how you see the medicine session and how things are unfolding? And I do think there's always some unknowns in psychedelic and plant medicines, but I think having some frameworks, having some self reflection about what are your skills, what are not your skills, and really owning that. And then also, yeah, how do you really collaborate with your clients and to try and give them a lot of agency and a lot of, yeah, empowerment in the process?
There's a lot there. Thanks, Deanna. Yeah. One of the pieces that's coming up for me into the conversation is around you saying choice is really important for people to feel that they have, to kind of regain, and to kind of practice that out in that session. And that kind of empathetic witness can be within oneself or with the practitioner they're working with. But it's really interesting that choice is so important, even though when working with psychedelics, you can't really control what's going to happen or what's going to come up or how much or how intense it's going to be or how soon. And one of the really important pieces for me around the question of like, what is it being trauma-informed all about? It's in the preparation work, it's doing the assessment work, it's in a sense, the honoring the person by developing a safe relationship with them at a pace that feels right. And it might be that they're trying to rush it and that we have to slow it down. Or, I think just really going at the pace that is right. And obviously the more trauma that's there, then the slower hopefully we can go, kind of just feeling into that and understanding what that could look like kind of as a map. And I think it's just that kind of iterative dance of going slowly and exploring the person's life, knowing kind of what are some of the fears, what are some of the reactions that might happen, and how much awareness is there about what could be, in a sense, lurking or hidden or unconscious. How aware are we of that? And yeah, for me, I had an experience working with a client ages ago. I was working in this clinic, kind of inner city style. I think I was seeing 35 clients a week. And a woman walked in, first session, broken English. I think she was from Afghanistan or Pakistan, refugee. She'd, experienced, quite a lot of loss from the Taliban. And she was experiencing domestic abuse as well from her partner. And literally, the moment she sat down, I closed the door and I just said hello and looked at her, and she just broke down, not just in tears, but almost, really, it was almost like in a trance-like dissociative state, almost like a seizure. And it was just a trauma reaction, because in a sense, it was the first time she'd ever felt safe. That she'd had, in a sense, the freedom to express herself, and it just all like her body, and it just overloaded her nervous system, and so she literally just collapsed on the floor, and she unfortunately had to kind of go to hospital to be checked out, and she was discharged, and then came back, and we started working together. But that was just this moment of like being given permission to feel safe, to feel control and choice, and so much had been stored up. It just kind of short-circuited her body, and that's what I think a lot of folks we just get used to holding it in our systems for so long, and it's like, how do we titrate that? So we're not short-circuited. And I think you mentioned some of the techniques there and some of the concepts that are useful, but just around that, like titrating it and kind of preparation and assessment and, pacing it. Any kind of nuggets of wisdom or techniques that you've used, or any kind of good kind of vignettes of working with clients that have really taught you what works in those kinds of scenarios?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. And I mean, yeah, first and foremost, a proper assessment is really helpful. And for both parties, for them to know it's hard to do informed consent. Like, that's again, maybe something we're not talking about so much. It's hard to say, okay, I've never had experiences with these things, and now I'm giving informed consent about working with psychedelics, but I don't know. Both of us have no idea where that's going to go for you. But can you can you agree upon that? And so I think that assessment for both parties, like also giving them again choice, like this is what this could look like. These are some of the options. These are, sometimes people leave and they feel really good and clear and grounded, and sometimes people are really dysregulated afterwards. And there's, I'll talk about that. It's like that opening up of all these things they've been holding, and asking questions like, yeah, is your life okay to support that right now? Like, is this the time? What would you need in order to kind of hold that if things fell apart for a little while? Because it's all about kind of how we perceive of these things. If we perceive of them as a magic cure, then it's a bit different than if we kind of see them as a disruptive tool. And how they disrupt is unknown. And clients are stepping into that with you as a practitioner. So it's a bit of that dance of kind of not scaring them off, but being honest, like that this is the possibility, this is the range of possibility. How do you feel about that? Um, and I think experiential avoidance is one of the things that we're working with a lot when we're working with trauma. And so when you talk about titration, can we do some somatic inquiry? Like, can we do some, when you're here, when you're talking about your trauma, are you okay that I slow you down in the preparation phase? Are you okay that I ask you, how does that sit in your body? When you're talking about a big emotion, are you talking over it? Are you okay if I pause and we stay with it? That's going to help me gauge someone's capacity to kind of turn towards their experience. And often, as a practitioner, that's what I'm looking for in the preparation. How well can this person stay with, or are they really just not in contact with their direct experience in the present moment? And so I think that this comes from somatic experiencing, really starting to build out the capacity of a client system by not actually going first towards a trauma, by talking about things that are resourcing, that are supportive, places in the body that are neutral. If there's someone that have a lot of anxiety, like, what are places in your body that are not anxious right now? And like, they're like, oh, well, I guess my legs. Oh, okay. Can we notice your legs? So really starting to kind of, I like to see it as that psychedelics work in this way of opening up and connecting us with the body, the sensation, emotions, our thoughts as well. They're definitely part of the equation. And then there's the transpersonal and the larger world. But like, what happens when we start to kind of work in a similar way to psychedelics in preparation? Can we go towards that difficulty? Can we stay with that feeling? Is there a lot of avoidance towards it? Okay. And then really starting to bring in the concept that people are complex beings, and there's a lot of multiplicity in our parts, and they all are playing different roles. And I think this is where compassion really supports this work, that all of these responses are normal and again have been very protective, but maybe we can start to renegotiate with some of those protectors, and we can start to renegotiate with some of those responses that are like, I don't want to go towards this difficult thing. So I would say a lot of trauma work is building out the capacity, which you can start to do in preparation. And then start to kind of go towards those difficult places. And again, with a lot of choice, but see how that lands for people.
I love it. Thank you. And Deanna, this is a bit funny. I just had a realization that you're Deanna Rogers that we always quote for the last 3 years in Vital
Oh,
about one very particular. Like, I know that's you. I know,
okay.
but I've just got so used to saying, like, we've got a slide where it says, "Oh, so as Deanna Rogers says," there's a quote that we have around shaking the ground. You know that
Mm,
one. And it's
I
really
don't know
funny,
what's
like,
the I'm not sure.
that's you.
Okay,
So we do
great.
citate you properly, I promise. We're not
Okay.
plagiarizing your
No,
work.
all good.
But yeah, would you be okay to kind of just share that quote or paraphrase it and just share, you kind of touched on it just now, but kind of what that means, but particularly in using psychedelics to work, any kind of work, but especially with trauma work and around, what may open up because of that.
I don't know the quote you used. Do you remember what it is?
Yeah, it's a legendary quote we've now got in a kind of vital pantheon in law.
Great.
It's something paraphrased like,
Yeah.
are you ready? Are you stable enough to have the ground of your life, or to have your groundedness shaken, and for whatever kind of comes from that, to meet it.
Yeah, and so I guess, if I bring it back to my own experience, I'm not going to go into the depths of what came up for me after my first ayahuasca experience, but it was just, yeah, there was all of this emotion that I had no context for. Like my mind didn't even have a story really. It was just, I was having all these really big feelings, which is very common post post experiences. And so I think that, like, what people need to be ready for is, and it's a little bit different, like if you're going on a 2-week retreat where there's multiple experiences, so much can happen and be opened up in that, versus like maybe you're working um, with a one-on-one practitioner and you have one experience and you have prep and integration right after, and it's kind of being held more. But I think that what I would love folks to kind of consider, either as a client or as a practitioner, is what is the container that this person needs around potentially opening up a lot of what their system is carrying. So, some people do great in group work and they don't need integration sessions. Some people do great sitting with their best friend who they feel really safe with and don't need a therapist. Um, and some people, that's not true. It's like a lot of whatever it is, big waves of anxiety, panic attacks, things I've seen amplified have been suicidal ideology. I know there people talk about it as something to, potentially work with that symptom, but it also can amplify it if we think about them as non-specific amplifiers. It's like whatever is there, maybe it's terror that they didn't get to experience from living in an area where there's war. Maybe it's, um, I don't know, grief that's been held down for many generations. Maybe it's uh, a lot of, I've also seen people go through manic episodes where they're not sleeping and they're believe they're larger than life. And, I've seen people become violent with these medicines and start to physically hurt people. Are you prepared to deal with that? And I think just for folks that are curious about doing this, like there are times in life where things have to fall apart. And, you know, are you okay to be in that kind of gray area of it could be messy? Like I could have to have this period where I don't know exactly what's going on, and we can work with that and we can process that through integration work, but it could be difficult. And so I think it's just really, this is where I think informed consent comes in, and how people talk about or even um, try and sell. Like I think there's a lot of like selling these experiences that happen, like this will be the thing that cures your depression or PTSD, or even underground practitioners saying you'll feel X after working with me, and so I think all of that stuff is just to really be mindful of it and to hold the possibility that people will be great after a retreat and feel good and centered, but also to hold the possibility that maybe those really vulnerable parts that need to be held, that need to be felt, that need to be seen, will finally have the space to come forward, and that can be challenging. And so to just, I guess, give it the reverence that it deserves in many ways. That this can be a really sacred and messy work, and what is the support system that they need in order to work through that in a good way.
Oh, I love that. I love that you're connecting sacred and messy together. Like
Yeah.
sacred isn't necessarily this really clean,
They're
predictable,
best
kind of
friends.
beautiful thing. Yeah, like you think of sacred being this, everything's just great, perfect and predictable and, shiny. But no, it's actually really messy and
Oh, it's
tough
so
and
messy.
painful
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
angst-ridden. That's sacred. Because it's so real and so raw and so right now, and I'm in it, I'm facing it, and it's happening, and oh God, it's tough, and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That's sacred.
Yeah.
And there's a part of this. There's a concept I've been really appreciating the last few years around ontological rupture, ontological shift. That I like saying because it makes me sound more intelligent than I am, especially with an English accent. It's just great, but. There's this idea that our sense of self and reality, particularly, and also the aspect of socialization and culturalization of ourself as an entity or commodity is significant. And we were just talking about, titrating and going at a certain pace. But ultimately, there can be a shaking of the ground and a messiness that includes this kind of ontological rupturing, particularly in the Western world, which is very secular, materialistic, fast-paced, superficial, but more so than some other traditions of the world. And boy, when we have those experiences that are particularly that might be transpersonal, that might be kind of very hard to make sense of them, and that might, in a sense, contradict our previously held beliefs about who I am, or the meaning of my life, or what I value, or how I conceptualize my sense of family and culture. That's huge. Like that is not just this quick fix that's going to cure me and give me this shiny new life. It's going to take a lot of unpacking and a lot of integrating, a lot of questions I have no idea how to answer. I don't even know what the question is that I'm supposed to be asking myself here. And that's sacred work. And okay, let's go there. What do we need just right now, short term, to help you, like supports and resources, and what changes and kind of and stabilization do you need in your life, just short term? Let's start with that. So I don't know how that resonates with you around kind of doing clinical work with people, or knowing about working in more indigenous traditions, particularly in kind of natural wilderness-based retreats, or even in some of the work that folks are doing in the underground. But there's some massive rupturing of realities and identities and cultures and kind of social norms that are part of the healing process, both individually and I think collectively as well. And that's why the sense of it, if we're going through this together and we can share, this is my experience and it's not identical to yours, but there's some similarity there, or there's similarities in how we're kind of rebuilding and kind of sense making of it afterwards. That validation can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's there's a I don't even know, cognitive seems like a very limited, like there is this deep existential piece to this work. And, again, like I think that one thing I appreciate is that these medicines are asking the psychological movement to really expand people are having these deep questions around spirituality, existential questions. They're feeling their bodies for the first time. It's like, okay, we're all of a sudden not just this little mind and the kind of beliefs we've been given through our conditioning, in our family or culturally or socially. Um, People are really starting to see the kind of larger picture and how that influences them, and vice versa. So yeah, it's again, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but again, it can be really disorienting. And we need a lot of support to kind of unravel. I think homeostasis is a term that can be often thought about in integration. It's like the cell wants to stay the same. And in our network, they want us to stay that same cell. And so it's like, what can we do? What are the conditions to provide that being or that person with a different opportunity, and to not make it return back to exactly what it needs to be? Because integration, so even if you're the only person in your family doing this work, like that family system's also holding you, and they're often holding you in a certain belief and light and value. So there's there's a lot within this that we can do, but it is like beliefs are a huge part of what gets interrupted. And again, they're a huge part of what gets impacted originally with trauma too, like the who am I and what's the world. These are really important things that people start to have a certain flavor when there's been a lot of trauma in their life. I am unsafe, the world's unsafe. I need to do these things to keep myself safe. um, I can't tell you how many people I've worked with where we've had experiences that have been corrective, and they're like, oh my God, my whole life. They like kind of have contact with a younger part who believed they had to do X to be loved. And they're like, wow, like actually nothing, I'm okay. Nothing's really wrong with me. Like, what happens when nothing's wrong with me? Like, does that change everything that I have to, like, how I view myself? And oh, wow, okay, like all of these ways that I've overcompensated for some really early part that wasn't seen and appreciated for who they were. And everyone has a version of that, even if they had a pretty great upbringing. But yeah, how do we start to unpack this kind of chronic sense of there's something wrong with you, which is really indoctrinated in the Western culture? There's something wrong with you. You need to be fixed. I'm broken. I'm not enough. I'm not lovable. All of these beliefs. And when we start working on that level, what happens? A lot can shift, but it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of resistance, externally and internally, often.
I love that we're getting to this part of the conversation, Deanna. Really important to, in a sense, differentiate between beliefs and reality about self, and that messiness and that kind of falling apartness. And that belief that there's something inherently wrong with me, like I am messed up, like I'm a messed up person, versus, I've had XYZ happen to me, or I have these difficult emotions or thoughts, and I struggle with these anxiety, depression, OCD, self-harm, whatever it might be. And some of that is because I have this inherent belief, for example, like, oh, I'm inherently messed up, flawed, there's something wrong with me. Whereas when, like, I love how you just said that, like you had that client who's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm okay, all this time I've been okay, but I've had this belief all of this time that just appeared. And it said that, and oh, yeah, there's something wrong with me. That's what looked back at me in the mirror.
Mm, yeah. And it's again just kind of like that integration of our stories we tell ourselves, the narratives we have about ourselves, and how that influences our state. So if I have the belief that something's inherently wrong with me, and everyone has some kind of version of that, myself, and I've been working through some of that myself. Like everyone I've met has some version of that story. And but what does that story tell my body? It's like, oh, I have to be on guard. I have to be like some version of tension usually, versus if I like even just try on that story of, oh, I'm okay. Like, yeah, I felt my body relax. Like, even just saying that now, like in this moment, like my body's like, oh, okay, we're okay. And how, again, um, not to say that a healthy nervous system always has to be a relaxed one, but, ultimately what we're trying to do is that someone can have a flexible nervous system to meet these different states. And so I think that, again, one of the things I really appreciate about this, about psychedelics and the potential, is we can start to see the relationship between these different aspects of self. And the cognitive piece is a big one. And those stories we tell ourselves and the beliefs we hold, and how we can start to diffuse or decenter or create some space from these things that we've, again, at a very early age adopted because they were helpful, but start to renegotiate them as an adult, can be really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though I think CBT gets a bad rap
Yeah.
in the psychedelic community, and I'm definitely one of them that does rap badly about CBT and the limits of it. It's kind of concept of using, core negative beliefs, I think, is really, really powerful, and how those just show up, in inner narratives, and just relationships as well. And I love that you're talking about relationships and homeostasis. You mentioned, Deanna, how like we're not necessarily trying to go back to homeostasis. In a sense, homeostasis might not necessarily be the desired outcome, at least right now in the short term, because it's evolving. Like post-traumatic growth, it's like we're moving. We don't know where exactly to yet, and there could be relationships, family, friends, spouses, colleagues at work, religion, culture, that reinforce, in a sense, the old status quo, the old narrative, the old kind of insecurities, or the old homeostasis that, in a sense, is somewhat fluid or perhaps dismantled. And, we work as well with Adele LaFrance, and she does a lot of work around families and systems and relationships. And that is a really important part of the preparation and the integration work with whatever does happen in the medicine sessions. So I don't know if there's anything around else about kind of relationships as well, and kind of systems and community and integration circles that you've found works.
Yeah, a while ago I made an integration needs framework, and just kind of like, what are the main needs post experience? And one of them is connection to others and kind of the natural world. And so there again, this is kind of a result that happens. And if we're kind of, I'm trying to keep the tie of trauma here. So often trauma can cause disconnection with self and others. And so a big need for people post experience is to have more supportive relationships. And so it may mean there's a lot of grief and loss of relationships that don't serve them, or boundaries that need to be set up. And it might mean there's a desire for like minded community, might be understanding the impact of some of these relationships and how that's played out for them. Um, it's a big piece, again, that's maybe not talked about so much. And then, yeah, desire for people to. I've just had this like one of the best experiences of my life and one of the most transformative. I can't talk to anyone about it. So,
Right.
or they don't feel comfortable talking to people about it. So, where can we make those community spaces? And so, I think integration circles can be awesome for that. Yeah, but who are those folks? Maybe it's that they have to find local groups, but it's a big one because can that system grow and change with, and can there be a new homeostasis reached within that kind of unit? Again, I think it's like you can think about it on the individual, on the kind of whatever version of family, friends, like those close relationships, and then you can think about the kind of larger cultural piece. But yeah, what's willing to kind of grow and change with the individual, and what wants to keep them where they were, and how does that change how that whoever's going through that experience wants to relate to that system. Maybe it's that they don't have as much contact. Maybe it's that they lose some friends. Maybe it's that they need to go and find some other folks that are doing this kind of work. I've had lots of integration clients over the years doing this in like rural Canada or America, being like, I don't have anyone I can go to talk to about this. Or even people have had therapists saying, my therapist doesn't really want to talk to me about this work. And this was like one of the most healing experiences of my life, and they don't really know how to engage with it. I'd say that's probably less the case, but as time goes on. But yeah, it still can be a reality for folks.
Yeah, that's a really important point, is having those networks kind of set up to connect and relate these experiences. And it is hard because they're hard to talk about, they're hard to make sense of, and it's hard to express them, and we might not have great relationships already. And I think the legality or criminality of drugs and psychedelics creates this whole other layer of reservation and silence. So yeah, I think that's where integration circles are awesome. Yeah, and I like what you're saying there around homeostasis kind of evolving and kind of pushing it out, and that the use of psychedelics in particular enable us to kind of, reprocess trauma so that we can have some post-traumatic growth, some kind of new homeostasis kind of evolves and gets pushed out. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else around that topic of particularly post-traumatic growth that you want to share just before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think, why I hope, maybe I'll go to the first part and then the second, but why I hope practitioners might be trauma informed is there is a huge potential of helping people to reprocess or re-experience or move through these things that their nervous system have been holding for, again, depends on how you view this. Maybe their lifetime, maybe it's an ancestral piece that has been passed on through their genes. So if we have some skills and we have some way to support our clients to kind of move through these experiences with that essence of safety, there is a lot of potential to start to kind of develop these new skills to have a wider access of regulation, to start to kind of change some of these beliefs about themselves, to develop more meaningful relationships. And so, if you kind of take this transdiagnostic lens, some of the things that I hope people can work on if the environment is supportive for them is to feel more empowered to go towards their direct experience in the present moment, to feel their feelings, have a larger capacity for regulation, to deal with stress and triggers in their everyday life. So to kind of expand that window of tolerance is one way you might think about it. And ultimately have more meaningful lives. And again, that I don't think that we can sell the fantasy that everything will be fixed and ultimately changed through these medicines. But I think what we can do is increase resiliency and the capacity to process that internal information. So if it's that negative anxiety loop that's coming up in our thoughts, that we can, see it, that we can be with those difficult sensations and maybe drop down to that body sensation of anxiety, learn to work through it, breathe, that we can start to resource ourselves with the difficulties of life, that we can see a shitty situation that happens for everyone in life, and that we can say, hey, this is really hard right now. And like to kind of have some inner compass that said, yeah, I'll get through it. So really, I think this resiliency and this kind of increased capacity is really what I hope for people when they're doing working with these medicines for that purpose of working with trauma. And then ultimately, yeah, again, this kind of whatever that person's North Star is of, why am I here? What's important to me? And these deeper questions around purpose and values and how they can live that a little bit more in their day-to-day experience. So that's my hopes for folks when they're doing this. And I don't think we can alleviate suffering and struggling, but we can teach people how to deal with it, because that's part of life in many ways. So that's
beautiful.
That's my last thought on that. But
that's a really nice place to end the conversation, in the meaningfulness of life, particularly as a way of, in a sense, being attuned to oneself and having that authenticity to meet whatever challenges are coming up in the day to day. Like, not to have gone, oh yeah, I've healed my trauma, but to be okay, what's happening today? How am I feeling today? How am I showing up? What beliefs, what thoughts are coming up? What's my North Star right now? And that's a meaningful life. And it means, the work is never done, but we're constantly integrating. But wow, what a life that is.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Deanna. This was so nice. Thank you for coming on to the show. Just before we say goodbye, just tell folks where they can find more information about you and what you're involved with and how they could reach out.
Sure. I think probably the easiest is my website, although it needs a overhaul, is deannacrogers.com.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll pop that in the show notes. Yeah, it's a lovely website. I was just looking at it. You've got some really nice photos there.
Thanks. Yeah. Appreciate it. I just need to update it, but that's okay. It'll happen. Yeah. Life is full. That's one of the things I dropped.
Right.
That's okay. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah. Nice to connect a little bit more with you personally. Yeah. And I'm guessing I'll probably see a little bit more of you over this next while. So thank you, David.
Yeah. Thank you, Deanna. Lots more happening in the Vital world, but for now, it's been an awesome conversation. And thanks for all your work. And it's great to quote you as well after. That was awesome. The great Deanna Rogers. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care.